joining us today. My name is Karen Shery. As Glencore mentioned, I'm a curator at the Virginia Museum of History and Culture. I work as a historian here, and I kind of came to this subject through one of my first projects at the museum when I joined about 4 years ago. I organized an exhibition called Determine, the 400-Year Struggle for Black Equality. It was an exhibition hosted at the VMHC here in Richmond that was part of the statewide commemoration of the 400th anniversary of the arrival of the first captive Africans here in Virginia in 1619. And that exhibition ran from June 2019 to the pandemic closed it a little early in March 2020. We also recently published a book with that same title. So I'm coming at today's topic as a historian to provide some historical background for systemic racism that is part of not just our society at large, but also our healthcare and our mental health care systems. I like to start these talks by with a caveat that I am not a mental health practitioner. I don't have expert knowledge in the field of psychology and related behavioral health fields. I'm not a medical doctor. I am a historian, so I am coming to this topic through that lens. But nevertheless, I hope this broad historical overview provides you all some helpful frameworks for thinking about your own practices in the field. As Glencore mentioned, please feel free to enter questions into the Q&A session. We'll get to those at the end of my remarks. I'd also like to give a quick forewarning that this is going to be a gallop. I have a lot of material to get through, but as Glencore mentioned, we'll be making PDFs of these slides available to you. So if you miss a quote or an image or something, you can go back and review those later. So buckle up and let's get started. The title of my presentation is Historical Frameworks: How the History of Racism Has Impacted Black Mental Health and Health Care. And this is a topic that, I can get my slides to advance. There we go. It feels very urgent today, given the past couple of years of a national racial reckoning that we have been having as a society, brought to a head by the murder of George Floyd, the coronavirus pandemic, and a series of racial justice protests that occurred in this country beginning in 2020. These were all events that really focused our national lens on enduring problems of racial inequities and of systemic racism across our nation in all branches of endeavor, in history and healthcare and education and so forth. And just quickly put on the screen a few disparities in mental health care that have been part of this recent conversation. There's a recognition that Black Americans are less likely to have access to care, less likely to have access to good quality care. They're less likely to be subjects in research, et cetera, et cetera. So what I hope to provide today is a historical framework for how we got to this present day moment of such persistent racial disparities. These disparities are rooted in 400 years of history of racial discrimination and oppression through slavery, through segregation, through racist violence directed against people of color, so forth. So I'm going to do a broad chronological sweep, starting with the beginning, the colonial period and the arrival of the first enslaved Africans in Virginia in 1619. This was really part of Britain's entry into the international slave trade that had been going on for at least a century and a half before 1619. But in the early decades of the 1700s was when the British Empire got involved in that international slave trade of forcibly taking captive Africans from various parts of that continent and forcing them to labor in various New World colonies, particularly in South and Central America and the Caribbean, but also in North America. And from the get-go, we see in Virginia in 1619, when two British privateers bring, we think about 50 enslaved Africans to our shores here in 1619, almost from that very, very beginning. While there are not a lot of records, we do see colonial Virginians distinguishing people by race. And you can see that on the slide in the detail from a muster that was taken in the Virginia colony in 1625. That's kind of like a census in which all the inhabitants of a household are listed. And Angela, who is one of those first Africans brought here in 1619, is listed and identified by race. Angela, a Negro woman brought on the treasure. That was the name of the ship. So we have racial differentiation and racial discrimination from the very beginning of slavery in Virginia society. That would explode over the course of the rest of the 1700s and through the 1800s, particularly here in Virginia. Not only was Virginia the first permanent English settlement in North America, it was also the largest and most powerful British colony in America. And that was primarily because of tobacco. When colonists first came to Virginia and settled in Jamestown in 1607, they had hoped to find all kinds of valuable riches here in the colonies. They didn't find gold and so forth, but what they did find was arable land that they often had to displace the indigenous inhabitants from. And they found this land was particularly fertile for tobacco cultivation, and there was a great demand for tobacco in Europe. So as Virginia developed as a colony, it started to expand first along Virginia's various rivers and other waterways, inland, and eventually across what is today the entire state. What went hand in hand with the development of tobacco was the development of a system of slavery, because tobacco is a very labor-intensive crop and it required lots of laborers. Initially, the Virginia colony relied predominantly on white indentured servants who came from England and Europe. And these were white workers who would sign up. They would sign a labor contract, usually for about 4 to 7 years. They were indentured to work for their employer for that set amount of time in exchange for their transatlantic passage and for room and board until the end of their indenture. Tobacco planters over the course of the 1600s realized that it was much more economical to use enslaved Africans. So over the course of those years, we start to see a real explosion of the number of enslaved Africans and people of African descent being brought to Virginia and the other British colonies to work in a system of bondage. And you can see from this chart how in 1620, initially, there were only a couple dozen Black people. In 1670, 50 years later, the numbers start to grow, so much so that by 1770, on the eve of the American Revolution, more than 40% of Virginia's colonial population is made up of people of African descent. Virginia was always the colony with the largest Black population of any of the British colonies, and indeed any of the United States once America became an independent nation. These enslaved people were subject to forced labor, to often very harsh working and living conditions, and also very harsh punishments. I'm showing an image of a slave collar. There are records in the colonial archives of people being punished by being forced to wear one of these collars, designed to be not only physically cumbersome and uncomfortable, but also a visible deterrent to others who might consider some act of rebellion, such as trying to run away, escape, or some other punishment, or some other act that was deemed a punishable offense. You get a sense of the barbarity of colonial law against people of African descent. In the case of Robert Carter, who was the largest and wealthiest planter in colonial Virginia, he was known as King Carter because of his stature. He got permission from the Virginia courts in 1708 to cut off the toes of two enslaved people, a man and a woman whom we only know by name as Bambara Harry and Dinah. Robert Carter got permission from the courts to physically dismember them, to cut off their toes, in order to deter them from trying that act again. Also to deter others from trying the same, trying to escape. So that gives you, I think, not only a sense of the barbarity of the system of human bondage that was taking shape here in Virginia, but also of the intense desire for freedom among enslaved people. They were willing to take those kinds of risks, and those kinds of harsh punishments in order to be free. As the population of enslaved people grew into the 18th century, British society and colonial law had to accommodate the existence of slavery. As I say, slavery was relatively new in the British Empire in 1619 when the first captive Africans were brought here. But the law pretty quickly caught up. And here's a slide that shows just a few series of laws that show colonial Virginia codifying the system of slavery as we think of it today. For example, in 1662, a law was passed by Virginia's equivalent of the General Assembly that a child's status follows the status of the mother. I just highlight that one of these several laws to showcase how the laws were written to benefit slaveholders and the system of slavery. This law declaring that a child's status follows the status of the mother is a radical departure from hundreds of years, millennia of British common law, which followed the practice of primogeniture. Your status followed your father. Well, to make slavery a more profitable and beneficial system for enslavers, it was better if children took on the status of their mother, such that when enslaved women reproduced, the enslaver had more enslaved people. This is one example of how the law was codified and developed to really benefit the enslavers, who were the same people who were the wealthy planters who were controlling Virginia and other colonial governments. This brings us up to the Revolutionary War, the war by which America gained its independence, established the United States as a free country, gaining its independence from Britain. Ironically enough, often with the cries that Britain was treating Americans like slaves. George Washington regularly made that kind of reference with apparently no sense of irony, given the fact that he himself was a slaveholder. But this brings us to, I think, what's one of the most fundamental paradoxes of America is that we are a nation that was founded on the principles of universal equality and liberty and freedom, yet also on the reality of slavery. At the opening of the American Revolution, all 13 of the original American colonies practiced slavery. It was much more prominent in the southern colonies, just simply because of the agricultural nature of their economies, but nevertheless, all the colonies practiced slavery at the outset of the American Revolution. Once America established its independence and over the ensuing 100 years until the Civil War, which finally ended 246 years of slavery in this nation, we start to see more and more northern states abolishing slavery, either immediately or gradually, and slavery becoming even more deeply entrenched in the South. So we start to see a pretty deep sectional divide between free states in the North, slave states in the South. And that sectional divide leads to pretty intense tensions between pro-slavery and anti-slavery forces. Those tensions ramp up over the course of the 19th century, especially as America starts to expand westward and gain more states. National politics and Congress are concerned about the balance between free and slave states. And so there are intense debates and series of compromises and so forth to try to preserve that balance as more states are added to the Union, as the country expands westward, displacing indigenous people in the process. As I mentioned, our nation is founded on this fundamental paradox that includes the fact that many of our founding fathers who penned some of those noble words were themselves enslavers, including George Washington, including Thomas Jefferson. Thomas Jefferson, who penned the Declaration of Independence and those words that all men are created equal, he was also a major proponent of what was emerging in the Enlightenment era, a belief that's now known as scientific racism, a belief that the races of man were fundamentally, biologically, inherently different. We know from genetic research of the 20th century, we've known since about the mid-20th century, that all human beings share like 99.9% of their DNA. There really isn't any genetic racial difference, such a thing as race, genetically speaking. But Enlightenment thinkers, including Thomas Jefferson, articulated a notion that there was a scientific biological difference between the races. And it's a system of thought that has been profoundly influential and is we're still feeling the effects of it today. And just to give you a sense of Jefferson's writings on this topic, here's an excerpt from his notes on the state of Virginia in 1782, when he is elencating some of the physical and mental differences between Black and white people. He suggests that Black people secrete less by the kidneys, more by the glands of the skin, which renders them more tolerant of the heat and less tolerant of the cold. He compares their faculties of memory, reason, imagination, and finds that in memory, they're equal to whites, but in reason, much inferior. These are the kinds of ideas that really shaped prejudices, racial prejudices and discrimination, many prejudices that still inform our society today. Jefferson was not alone. This was a kind of transatlantic system of thinking, scientific racism, and it really got to be codified in the 19th century, codified in such books as Josiah Nott and George Gliddon's Types of Mankind, in which they differentiate the races by their physiological traits, by the shape and the size of their skull and so forth, linking people of African descent to chimpanzees, linking white people to Greek gods like Apollo. You can see the kind of racism inherent in these sorts of diagrams. Another practitioner of this mode of thought, Dr. Collins, who wrote a treatise on slave management, he notes, there are many striking variations between the temperaments of the whites and those of the Negroes, sufficient almost to induce a belief of the different organization, which the knife of the anatomist, however, has never been able to detect. I find that really fascinating. He acknowledges that scientists, anatomists, doctors have not been able to find physical differences between the races, yet they're sort of sure that they exist. Gives you a sense of the pervasiveness of these ideas. These ideas also affect healthcare and attitudes about Africans. The notion that the American dark races bear with indifference tortures insupportable to a white man, this notion that Black people feel less pain than white people, led to really punitive practices in slavery, of whipping and other tortures. It also led Black people to become the subject of medical experimentation, such as an enslaved woman named Anarcha, who was used for gynecological experiments by Dr. Marion Sim, who's considered the father of modern gynecology. This also affects the emerging profession of mental health in the 19th century. These perceptions articulated by John Galt, who was the director of the Eastern Asylum, which was the first mental health hospital in Virginia, founded in 1773 in Williamsburg. John Galt felt that Black people are immune to mental illness. And he also felt that they are exempt from the pressures of modern life, what he called mental excitement, to which free people are subject in going about their daily business, the daily routines of life. He was sort of articulating a justification for slavery and a notion that Black people, that slavery was benevolent to Black people because it preserved their mental health, because it freed them from the daily pressures of putting food on the table, of conducting business out in the world, and so forth. Again, ideas that I think are maybe shocking and appalling to us today, but were very prevalent and popular in the 19th century. We also see some doctors pathologizing slavery in acts of rebellion by Black people. So we have a doctor, Dr. Samuel Cartwright, who in 1851 identifies what he sees as a disease when enslaved people try to self-emancipate, when they try to run away. He called it drapetomania, and classified it as a mental illness that prompted enslaved people to run away. Ridiculous notion that you had to be sick in order to want to escape from slavery. In the midst of this broader cultural, medical, and scientific discourse about racism, about perceived differences in physical and mental health between Black people and white people. We have to look at, to the extent that we can, the lives of Black people here in Virginia and throughout America under slavery. Of course, they were subject to all sorts of oppressions, but tried to live their lives, establish relationships, establish communities, practice cultural traditions to the best of their ability, and sometimes also rebelled in small ways, such as breaking instruments or slowing down their work, sometimes in larger ways, such as leading a slave rebellion, as Nat Turner tried in Southampton, Virginia in 1831. Some of the horrors endured by enslaved people in America included being subjected to sexual exploitation, to whipping and other kinds of physical tortures, and of course the familial and psychological torture of family separation, which was a daily threat and a reality for so many enslaved families. And the statistics on the screen, I think, give you a sense of that. 1 in 3 enslaved children were separated from their parents. 1 in 5 married couples were separated, and that was usually because an enslaver was selling some of his, what was considered his legal property, to other enslavers. And Virginia was really at the heart of the American slave trade because it had such a large population of enslaved people. It sold hundreds of thousands of enslaved people to other slave states. It was often called being sold down south or down the river. You were sold at the markets in Alexandria or Richmond, Virginia, or Portsmouth or other places around Virginia. Richmond and Alexandria were the largest slave markets in Virginia, and among the top 5 largest slave markets in the US in the antebellum period. And Virginia was the largest provider of enslaved labor in the 19th century. Congress had banned the importation of African slaves, of enslaved people from Africa in 1808. There was still illicit African trade going on, but the domestic market, the internal market, really picked up after that period. And Virginia, as I mentioned, became the primary supplier of enslaved people to the cotton fields in the South, to fuel the rise of King Cotton in our nation. So that's why family separation was such a common tragedy for so many Black families. It's important to note that there were free Black people in Virginia throughout the US, larger populations of free Black people in the North, of course, where slavery was being abolished in these decades. But there were communities of free Black people in the South as well. They were free, but they were not free of discrimination and oppression. Virginia had a series of laws that applied to free Black people, treating them differently than free white people and denying them the same kinds of rights as their white counterparts. Just one quick example, kind of hero of mine I discovered when I was working on the Determined Project, a woman named Jane Miner, who was a nurse in Petersburg. She earned her freedom by nursing the white and Black citizens of Petersburg through a pandemic in the 1820s. And then she continued to practice nursing for several decades. She also became an emancipator. She used her earnings to buy the freedom of 16 other women and children. Pretty remarkable story. We also see enslaved people, as I said, rebelling in various ways. And Anthony Burns was maybe one of the most famous. He became a a kind of national lightning rod in 1853 when he escaped slavery in Virginia. He made it to Boston. His enslaver found him in Boston, had him captured, and wanted to bring him back to Virginia under the terms of the Fugitive Slave Law of 1850. That caused a major major controversy in that abolitionists and northern free states were supporting his freedom. Southern states like Virginia wanted the federal government to come in and enforce the Federal Fugitive Slave Act and force Northerners to return an escaped man like Anthony Burns to his enslaver in Virginia. One of the many kind of lightning rods of debate leading up to the final sectional crisis, the Civil War. As I mentioned, and I'm going to go through these quickly, the nation was becoming increasingly fractured over the issue of slavery. Here's a map of the US in 1821 showing the distribution of slave and free states. By the outbreak of the Civil War, this is what the nation looked like. No pun intended, but the issue wasn't quite so black and white, if you will. History is always more complex. There were pro-slavery forces in the North. There were anti-slavery proponents in the South. So, you know, there's greater complexity around the issue of slavery. But we generally refer to slave states and free states because the leaders of those states who controlled the state government were either pro or against slavery. The North certainly benefited from slavery economically. Slavery was such a major force in the US economy, really in the fabric of the US economy throughout the 19th century. And the chart on the screen, I hope, gives you a sense that shows the value provided by enslaved people and their labor was $3.7 trillion in 1860. That's more than 3 times the value of all US manufacturing, which was valued at 1.1 trillion. And about 10 times or more, I can't do the math quickly in my head, the value of all US banks at just 500 million. So that gives you a sense of how economically critical slavery was in the US. Even if there were people who were against the institution, it's very difficult for the US to give it up because it was such a driver of fortune and wealth and economic prosperity. And that's why, you know, the Civil War was so devastating, why, you know, it took a sectional conflict with conservative estimates of more than 700,000 killed to finally end slavery in our nation. But looking forward, past slavery, past the end of the Civil War, into the period of Reconstruction and beyond. Right after the Civil War, during Reconstruction, we see a series of 3 amendments passed, ratified to the US Constitution. These were some of the most significant acts of civil rights legislation until the Civil Rights Movement of the 1960s, but these were the amendments, 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments that ended slavery in the United States, that defined former enslaved people as citizens and required due process of law and equal protection under the law to all US citizens, and also gave voting rights to Black men. Women did not get the right to vote until the 19th Amendment, until 1920. So after the war, we see Black Americans embracing the promises of freedom, embracing the promises of these new amendments and of American democracy. So we start to see Black men in Virginia exercising their right to vote, having a say for the first time ever in Virginia's government, not just as voters, but as elected office holders. Peter Jacob Carter was one of the longest serving members of the General Assembly. He served for 8 years after the Civil War. We start to see the development of Black schools and a public school system in Virginia. That was part of Reconstruction in Virginia, the establishment of public schools. They were segregated, and Black schools got lower funding than white schools did, but it was the first time many Black people had access to even just a primary education. We also see the development of Black colleges like the Hampton Institute and so forth. We see Black people building vibrant communities here in Richmond. Jackson Ward was often referred to as the Black Wall Street because of the prominent number of Black-owned businesses and the kind of economic and cultural vitality of these Black neighborhoods. John Mitchell ran one of the leading Black newspapers in the nation, the Richmond Planet. He was also a major civic leader, kind of alongside Maggie Lena Walker in Richmond's Jackson Ward. So we see the flourishing of Black communities, yet we also see backlash from the white establishment. After the federal government retreated from military control in the South, after Reconstruction, we start to see ex-Confederates and the same kind of white elite establishment that controlled Virginia under slavery resume power in Virginia and other Southern states. And they start to chip away at the gains that Black people had made through various measures, through various voter suppression efforts, through various laws, often called Black codes, that criminalized behaviors such as a Black person not having a job. They could be defined as a vagrant and sent to jail. So we start to see various ways in which the white establishment pushes back against the progress made during emancipation, and also reinstituting traditional racial hierarchies based on white supremacy. So we start to see a lot of Black people in Virginia, many of whom still worked in agriculture, which was a prominent industry in Virginia until well into the 20th century. We start to see Black people being forced into really unfavorable sharecropping arrangements. We start to see Virginia's government using Black codes and other laws to imprison Black people and force them into convict labor, which was a very profitable operation for the state. I want to come in with a little bit of mental health history here as well. Oh, I really need to speed up, sorry. After the Civil War, we see the first Black mental hospital established in Virginia, what was called the Central Lunatic Asylum for the Colored Insane, called Central State, which was founded in 1870. This was the first place that would take Black patients on a regular basis. Some white asylums occasionally would, but generally they were segregated. So this was the first treatment facility for Black people, but mental health care was still very much informed by notions of pseudoscientific notions of racial difference and Black mental inferiority. And one official of one such institution. He also pathologized Black freedom in this period as freedom that was something that was multiplying the mental health stresses that Black people were suffering. Kind of a way of adapting practice to the new reality in a post-slavery world. This is also the period, in addition to disenfranchisement, that Jim Crow segregation got codified across the South, got codified in law, was practiced in daily life. It also subjected Black people not just to kind of second-class citizenship in American society, but also to violent racist terrorism in the form of white supremacist violence from groups like the KKK and other entities. It's also codified by people like Dr. Walter Plecker, who is head of Virginia's Bureau of Vital Statistics and was a flaming eugenicist, a proponent of the pseudoscience of eugenics, which again tried to establish genetic differences among the races. He was affecting public policy by establishing racial purity laws and so forth in Virginia during his tenure at the Bureau of Vital Statistics. As far as thinking about, the impact of some of these ideas on Black Americans, I think W.E.B. Du Bois so poignantly articulated the notion of a double consciousness that Black people feel, of always looking at themselves through the eyes of systems and institutions set up by white supremacy. I'm sorry, I'm going to start going really quickly because I want to be sure to leave time for some questions. As a reaction to some of these new oppressions and discrimination of the Jim Crow era, many Black Americans leave the South seeking greater opportunities and less prejudice in some of the big urban cities of the North and Northwest, like Chicago, Pittsburgh, New York, etc. We also start to see the burgeoning of the civil rights movement in the first half of the 20th century, and the wars really crystallized this, World War I and World War II. Black Americans, they'd always fought in every single American war, but World War I and World War II, when they served in unprecedented numbers, they were being asked to fight tyranny abroad at the same time that they were facing tyranny at home. So their wartime service really crystallized a demand for freedom, and crystallized a notion that Black Americans needed to fight for equality here at home. So after World War II, the 1950s and 60s, we really see the kind of mass mobilization of the public in the civil rights movement through both legal actions in the case of, for example, a range of lawsuits that dismantled legalized segregation. Virginia played a big part of that in the figure of Barbara Johns Powell, who as a high school student led a protest in her school that ultimately became part of the Brown v. Board of Education decision, a decision mandating the desegregation of schools that was fought tooth and claw against by Virginia's white establishment, white supremacist government. We also see across the nation a massive direct action protests through marches, through sit-ins, through boycotts, and so forth. This movement really culminated in landmark civil rights legislation of the 1960s, the Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act, Fair Housing Act of the 60s, that at least in theory, legally leveled the playing field, eliminated discrimination on the basis of race, as well as sex and religion and national origin in employment, in voting, in housing, etc. So after the civil rights period, we see Black Americans starting to enter and exceed in all facets of American life. They could no longer be barred from a school or profession or so forth. And I think a culmination of that, perhaps the the most profound legacy of the civil rights movement is the election of our nation's first Black president, with President Barack Obama in 2008. Of course, we know that problems still exist, as we've seen in the past few years, in the wake of George Floyd's murder and social justice protests and debates about the status of Confederate monuments and so forth that have been gripping not just Virginia, but our nation's culture. And so many of these problems are rooted in the old discriminatory thought patterns, ideas, and practices of slavery and segregation. And just one example would be the practice of redlining, which was instituted during the 1930s, in which neighborhoods were graded according to their risk for mortgage guarantees. Generally, neighborhoods with people of color were redlined. That's where the term came from. They were deemed the riskiest neighborhoods for guaranteeing mortgages, largely because of racial prejudice. Well, those practices have led to disinvestment and destruction of neighborhoods of color, led to various forms of environmental discrimination that are still very much with us today. And just to bring it back to mental health, I just have a couple more minutes and then I'll open it to questions. Thank you for bearing with me. Looking at the mental health profession, of course, the Freudian notions of psychotherapy became kind of a dominant idea by the mid-20th century, with the notion that the human psyche was not differentiated by race. Humans shared a kind of universal, shared a psyche. There was a universalist notion of the human psyche. Nevertheless, disparities persist in both physical, medical health care and mental health care. And a kind of sad testament to this was in 2016 when University of Virginia's medical school did a survey of its students and found that a significant number of white medical students still believe that Black people are more tolerant of pain, that they have thicker blood than white people, that their blood coagulates more quickly. I mean, just notions that have no basis in fact, in medical genetic fact, are still very persistent today. The mental health profession, of course, went through major transformation in the middle of the 20th century through the deinstitutionalization, the clearing out of mental health hospitals, such as Central State Hospital. This was aided by the invention and development of psychiatric drugs. It was believed that you could give people medication, have them be cared for by family, by community centers, rather than large hospitals. To be sure, there were lots of problems at those large hospitals. They were expensive to run, but deinstitutionalization has come with its own set of problems. Virginia, between 1955 and 1994, deinstitutionalized about 80% of its mental health population. And I'm also showing some statistics nationally, which show how instead of large mental hospitals or community mental health facilities that never got built and funded at the level that they were envisioned to be, instead prisons often serve as the primary providers of mental health care for our populations. And disparities still exist in the mental health field, with the overdiagnosis of Black men for schizophrenia, 4 times more likely to receive this diagnosis than white people because of deep-seated prejudicial thinking. Yet at the same time, they're also underdiagnosed with PTSD and some other mood disorders. So I think I'll end on that note so we can open it up to questions.